Sir, please, where is the police station? I need to get there before he wakes up. The words didn't sound like a question. They sounded like a deadline. The kind that doesn't wait. The kind that, if missed, changes everything. The bell above the diner door had barely stopped ringing when the girl said it. Her voice was small but steady, too steady for someone her age. It carried across the room and settled into the quiet like a stone dropped into still water. Every fork paused. Every cup stopped halfway to someone's lips. Even the old jukebox in the corner seemed quieter somehow, humming beneath the surface instead of filling the room. Caleb Rourke didn't turn right away. He sat at the counter, broad shoulders slightly hunched over a chipped white mug, black coffee gone lukewarm in his hands. Leather vest worn soft with years. A road map folded beside him. His bike parked out front, still ticking from the long ride. He'd heard a lot of voices in his life. Angry ones, drunk ones, desperate ones. But this one didn't tremble, and that was what made it different. Slowly, Caleb lifted his eyes. The girl stood just inside the door, not moving any further in. Maybe 8, 9 at most. Too thin for the oversized coat hanging off her shoulders. The sleeves swallowed her hands completely, like she'd borrowed it from someone bigger. Her shoes were wrong. That's what he noticed next. One lace missing, the other tied in a knot so tight it had cut into the fabric. The soles worn down unevenly like she'd been walking farther than she should have. And her face. There it was. A faint bruise along her cheekbone, yellowing at the edges. A small cut on her lip. Not fresh enough to be from today, but not old enough to ignore. She looked straight at him, not at the waitress, not at the man by the window, not at the group of riders gathered in the back booth. At him, like she had already decided. Caleb set his mug down. The ceramic clicked softly against the counter, but in the silence of that moment, it sounded louder than it should have. "You're asking the wrong question," he said, voice calm, even. "You don't look lost." A flicker passed through her eyes. Not fear, recognition. "I'm not lost," she said. He nodded once, like he expected that answer. Behind him, one of the men in the booth shifted. Mason, big frame creaking against the vinyl seat. Another, Luke, leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as he took in the same details Caleb already had. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Years riding together had taught them how to read a moment without words. Caleb turned on his stool just enough to face her fully now. "What's your name?" he asked. The girl hesitated, not because she didn't know it, because she was deciding whether to give it. That alone told him more than anything else could. "Lena," she said finally. No last name. Of course not. Caleb nodded again, slower this time. "Well, Lena," he said gently. "Police station's about 6 blocks east. Straight down Maple, then you take a left past the gas station. Can't miss it." He could have stopped there, could have picked up his coffee, let her turn around, let the world take its course. Most people would have. Most people do. But Lena didn't move. She stayed right where she was, eyes still locked on his, like she was waiting for something else. Or maybe hoping for it. Caleb leaned back slightly, studying her more carefully now. "You walk here?" he asked. She nodded. "How far?" Another pause. "From Oak Ridge Lane?" That made Luke exhale quietly under his breath. That was no short walk, not for a kid, not alone, not in this weather. Caleb glanced toward the window. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, the kind that pressed down on the road and made everything feel colder than it was. Wind pushed dust and scraps of paper along the empty parking lot. He looked back at her. "You been walking long?" She didn't answer that one. Instead, her fingers tightened slightly inside the sleeves of that oversized coat. A small movement, but it said enough. From behind the counter, Ruth, the diner owner, stepped closer, drying her hands on a towel. Her eyes softened the moment she saw the girl up close. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "why don't you come sit down for a minute? I'll get you something warm." Lena shook her head immediately, too quickly. "No, I just need to know where to go." Caleb watched that response carefully. Not stubbornness, urgency. There was a difference. "You're in a hurry," he said quietly. She swallowed, and for the first time, her voice wavered just slightly. "He'll wake up soon." There it was. Not everything, but enough. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not sudden, not dramatic, just a weight settling into place where things start to matter. Behind him, Mason stood up slowly now, boots heavy against the floor as he walked closer. Luke followed, quieter, eyes never leaving the girl. They formed a loose line, not threatening, not crowding, but present, solid. Lena's gaze flickered between them, not afraid, just measuring, like she was trying to understand what kind of men they were. Caleb slid off the stool. Up close, he seemed even larger, not just in size, but in presence. The kind of man people usually stepped around without thinking. But when he spoke again, his voice stayed low, steady. "Lena," he said, "you planning to walk all the way there?" She nodded. "Yes." No hesitation, no doubt. Caleb glanced once at Mason, a look, a decision. Then back at her. "How about this?" he said. "You sit down for 2 minutes, warm up a bit. Then we'll figure out the fastest way to get you where you need to be." She hesitated again, longer this time. Her eyes dropped briefly to the floor, then back up to his. "You won't stop me?" she asked. That question landed heavier than anything else she'd said. Caleb shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "But I'm not letting you do this alone, either." The diner stayed quiet, waiting. Lena looked at him for a long moment. Then, finally, she took a step forward. Just one, then another. Slow, careful, like she was crossing into something unfamiliar. Ruth moved quickly, pulling out a chair near the counter. "That's it," she said softly. "Right here." Lena sat, perched at the edge, like she might bolt any second. Ruth poured hot chocolate into a thick ceramic mug, setting it gently in front of her. Steam curled upward, warming the space between them. Lena stared at it, didn't touch it yet. Caleb leaned one hand against the counter, watching her, not in a way that pressed, but in a way that stayed, present. "You said he'll wake up," he said quietly. "Who's he, Lena?" The girl didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the rising steam. And when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller but clearer than ever. "My stepfather." The words settled into the room like a storm rolling in from a distance. Slow, heavy, inevitable. And somewhere behind Caleb, a chair creaked as one of the riders shifted again. This time, not in curiosity, but in understanding. Something had already begun. Before we go any further, tell us something simple. Where are you watching from today? Maybe it's a quiet town, a busy city, or a place with roads that stretch farther than the eye can see. Wherever you are, settle in for a moment, because this story, Lena's story, is only just beginning. The diner slowly started to breathe again, not fully, not like before, but enough that the clinking of cutlery returned in cautious intervals, and someone near the window cleared their throat like they weren't sure if it was appropriate to make noise yet. Still, the air had changed. Everyone felt it. Because once a child says something like that, you don't really go back to normal. Lena sat on the edge of the chair, small hands wrapped loosely around the mug Ruth had placed in front of her. The steam had begun to fade, curling thinner now, but she still hadn't taken a sip. Caleb noticed. "Go on," he said gently. "It's not too hot anymore." She looked up at him briefly, like she needed confirmation. Then, carefully, she lifted the mug, both hands, slow. She took a small sip, barely more than a taste, and for just a second, something softened in her face. Not relief, not comfort, just warmth. It passed quickly, but Caleb saw it, and it told him something important. She hadn't stopped being a kid. Not completely. Ruth moved quietly behind the counter, already placing a plate together. Toast, a little butter, scrambled eggs. She didn't ask this time, just did it. Years of running that diner had taught her when to talk, and when to simply take care of things. Behind Caleb, Mason leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Lena with a look that didn't match his size. Luke had taken a seat again, but he wasn't eating, just listening, waiting. Caleb shifted slightly closer, lowering himself onto the stool beside Lena so he wasn't towering over her anymore. "You said your stepfather," he said calmly. "What's his name?" Lena stared into the mug again, like the answer was somewhere inside it. "Victor," she said after a moment. "No last name, again." Caleb didn't push for it, not yet. "And he's at home right now?" She nodded. "Sleeping." Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug again. "But not for long." There it was again, that quiet urgency. Not panic, not chaos, just a ticking clock only she could hear. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose. "All right," he said. "Then we don't waste time." He glanced over his shoulder. That was all it took. Mason straightened, Luke stood, even Hank, who'd been sitting in the far booth, older than the rest, gray beard resting against his chest, lifted his head and watched more closely now. No one asked questions. Not yet. Caleb turned back to Lena. "You said you walked from Oak Ridge Lane," he continued. "That's a long way." She nodded. "I had to go when he fell asleep." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them wasn't. Ruth set the plate down gently in front of Lena. "Eat a little," she said softly. "You'll think better." Lena hesitated. Then, almost mechanically, she picked up the fork, took a small bite, chewed slowly, like she was doing something she knew she should do, not something she wanted to do. Caleb watched her for a moment before speaking again. "Is anyone else there?" he asked. A pause, then, "My brother." The fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her eyes didn't lift this time. "He's 5. That landed harder than the rest. Luke looked away for a second, jaw tightening. Mason's arms crossed tighter against his chest. Even Hank shifted in his seat, the old vinyl creaking beneath him. Caleb didn't move. "Is your brother hurt?" he asked quietly. Lena swallowed. "I don't know," she said, "but he cries at night now." Silence. Real silence. The kind that settles deep. The kind that makes even strangers feel like they've stepped into something they weren't meant to hear, but can't walk away from either. Caleb leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "You came here to find the police," he said. Not because you were scared for yourself. It wasn't a question. Lena shook her head. No. Another bite of eggs, small, controlled. I had to get help before he wakes up, she repeated. There it was again, that mission, that purpose. She wasn't wandering, she wasn't hoping, she was executing a plan. Caleb felt something settle in his chest again, heavier this time. He'd seen grown men freeze in situations like that, seen people twice her size look away, pretend not to notice, convince themselves it wasn't their place. But this kid? She didn't hesitate. She just moved. Mason pushed off the wall and stepped closer now, his boots heavy against the tile. How long's he been like this? He asked, voice low. Lena didn't look at him. A while. Not specific, didn't need to be. Luke stepped in next, softer in tone. Your mom there too? That one made Lena pause longer than the others, her fork lowered back onto the plate. Yes. And she knows? Luke asked carefully. Lena's eyes finally lifted. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. She tries, Lena said, but she gets quiet. Those 3 words told more than a full explanation ever could. Caleb nodded once. He understood, too well. He straightened slightly, then reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. You did the right thing coming here, he said. You hear me? Lena didn't respond right away, but she didn't look away either. Caleb dialed, put the phone to his ear. The room stayed still again, not frozen this time, but focused, waiting. After a couple rings, someone picked up. Yeah, Caleb said, turning slightly away but not leaving Lena's side. It's me. I need you to listen carefully. We've got a situation. He paused, eyes flicking briefly toward Lena, then continued. Kid, about 8, walked in alone, signs of abuse. Younger sibling still in the house. Yeah. No, not later. Now. Mason and Luke exchanged a glance. Hank stood up slowly now, reaching for his jacket. Caleb's voice stayed calm, controlled, but there was steel underneath it now. Address is somewhere off Oak Ridge Lane, he said. We'll confirm in a minute. I want someone moving on this immediately, and I mean carefully. He listened for a moment, then nodded. Good. I'll call you back with details. He ended the call, slid the phone back into his pocket, then turned back to Lena. All right, he said, voice steady. Here's what's going to happen. The room leaned in again, not physically, but in attention. You're not walking anywhere else today, Caleb continued. You're staying right here where it's warm. Lena's grip on the mug tightened slightly. But my brother. We're getting to him, Caleb said gently, cutting in just enough to steady her. Faster than you could on foot, I promise you that. She searched his face, not like a child, like someone weighing truth, measuring it, deciding whether it was safe to believe. You promise? She asked. Caleb didn't hesitate. I don't say things I don't mean. A long moment passed. Then, slowly, she nodded. Behind him, engines didn't roar, not yet, but something else did. A quiet, unspoken agreement spreading through every man in that diner. This wasn't just a stop on the road anymore. This was a line drawn, and none of them were about to step back from it. Lena kept her eyes on Caleb for a few seconds longer, as if she was memorizing his face, storing it somewhere safe in her mind. Then she gave a small nod. Not big, not dramatic, but certain. And somehow that small nod carried more weight than anything else in the room. Caleb exhaled quietly, then glanced toward the others. That was enough. Things began to move. Not fast, not chaotic, but with purpose. Hank reached for his old leather jacket, slipping it on with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who had seen enough of life to know when something mattered. Mason stepped toward the door, already pulling his gloves from his back pocket. Luke moved closer to the counter, lowering his voice as he spoke to Ruth. "Keep her here," he said gently. "We won't be long." Ruth nodded without hesitation. "She's not going anywhere." Caleb turned back to Lena, lowering himself slightly so they were eye level again. "I need the exact address," he said softly. "You know it?" Lena nodded. 14 Oak Ridge Lane. No pause this time. She had it memorized. Of course she did. Caleb repeated it once under his breath, committing it to memory. Then he pulled his phone back out, stepping a few paces away, not to leave her, just enough to make the call clearly. "Yeah," he said as soon as the line connected. 14 Oak Ridge Lane. We're heading there now." "Yeah." Kid confirmed. 5 years old, still inside. He listened, eyes narrowing slightly. "No, we're not going in," he added after a moment. "We'll wait. Just get someone there fast." He hung up, turned back. By then, Mason had already pushed the diner door open. A gust of cold wind swept in, carrying the smell of asphalt and distant rain. It rattled the hanging sign for a second before the door closed again behind him. Outside, engines began to come alive, one by one, low at first, then building. That deep, familiar rumble that didn't just fill the air, it settled into your chest. Lena flinched slightly at the sound, not in fear, in surprise. Her eyes moved toward the window, watching the silhouettes of the bikes outside, large, steady, waiting. Caleb noticed. "That's us," he said quietly. She looked back at him. "All of you?" she asked. A faint hint of something almost like disbelief touched her voice. Caleb nodded. "We ride together." Simple as that. No explanation needed. Lena looked back toward the window again, and this time, her expression shifted. Just a little. Not fear, not even uncertainty. Something closer to understanding. Like she was beginning to realize she hadn't just asked one person for directions. She had walked into something bigger. Ruth gently slid the plate closer to her again. "Eat a bit more," she said softly. "You'll need your strength." Lena obeyed this time without hesitation. Small bites, quick, efficient, like she had a job to do. Caleb watched her for a moment longer, then reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a folded bandana. He set it on the counter near her. "In case it gets cold," he said. She looked at it, then at him. "Thank you." The words were quiet, but real. Caleb gave a small nod, then straightened up. "I'll be back," he said. That made her pause mid-bite. "How long?" she asked. There it was again, that clock, always ticking in her mind. Caleb thought for a second. "Not long," he said. "You'll see your brother soon." He didn't say hopefully. He didn't say we'll try. And Lena noticed that. She nodded again, clinging to that certainty. Caleb turned and headed for the door. Luke fell in step beside him. Mason was already outside, straddling his bike. Hank stood near the far end of the line, adjusting his gloves slowly, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The door opened. Cold air rushed in again, and then Caleb stepped out into it. The parking lot stretched wide and gray beneath a low sky. Wind pushed across the open space, tugging at jackets, carrying the distant scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet, but would. The bikes stood in a loose line, chrome dulled by dust, engines rumbling steady. Alive. Caleb walked toward his bike, running a hand briefly along the seat before swinging a leg over. The motion was fluid, practiced. Luke mounted beside him. Mason glanced over. "You think he's still asleep?" Mason asked over the low growl of engines. Caleb adjusted his gloves. "Doesn't matter," he said. "We're not waiting long." Hank's voice came from the other side, rough but calm. "Police on the way?" Caleb nodded. "Yeah, we hold position till they get there." Mason gave a short nod. Good. No one here was looking for trouble, but none of them were backing away from it either. Caleb looked once more toward the diner window. Inside, he could see Lena, small figure at the counter, barely visible through the glass. Ruth stood nearby, one hand resting lightly on the counter, keeping watch without hovering. Lena wasn't looking at the food anymore. She was looking at them, at the bikes, at him, waiting. Caleb held that glance for half a second longer. Then he started the engine fully. The sound deepened, solid, final. "Let's ride," he said. And just like that, they moved. Out of the parking lot, onto the open road. The wind hit harder once they picked up speed, cutting through layers of leather and denim. The road stretched ahead in a long gray ribbon, lined with bare trees that swayed slightly under the weight of the coming weather. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Each man knew the destination. Each one understood the reason. This wasn't a casual ride. This wasn't just another stretch of highway beneath their wheels. This was something else. Something that had started the moment a small girl walked into a diner and asked the right person the wrong question. Caleb's eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, but his thoughts weren't there. They were back in that diner, on a chair too big for her, holding a mug with both hands, trying not to shake. He tightened his grip slightly on the handlebars. They picked up speed, faster now, wind louder, engines stronger. Oak Ridge Lane wasn't far, but every second mattered, because somewhere ahead, behind a door, inside a quiet house, a 5-year-old boy was still waiting, and he didn't even know help was already on its way. The road narrowed as they turned off the main stretch. Oak Ridge Lane wasn't the kind of place people passed through by accident. It sat a little apart from everything else. Older houses, uneven fences, yards that hadn't been cared for in a long time. The kind of street where people kept to themselves, and neighbors learned not to ask questions. The bike slowed as they rolled in, engines still rumbling but quieter now, measured. Caleb led the way, eyes scanning every house number as they passed. 8, 10, 12, then, "There," Luke said, his voice low through the wind. Number 14. Caleb saw it at the same moment. The house stood slightly back from the road, like it was trying to disappear, paint peeling along the sides, curtains drawn tight even in the middle of the day. The yard was uneven, patches of dirt showing through where grass used to be, and in the driveway, a truck, old, still, but recently used. Caleb slowed to a stop along the curb. The others followed, engines dropping into a low idle that filled the quiet street like distant thunder. No one got off their bikes right away. They just looked, observed, took it in. Mason leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing. "That's the place," he muttered. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah." He cut the engine. One by one, the others followed, and just like that, silence. Heavy. The kind that presses against your ears. Caleb swung his leg off the bike and stood still for a moment, taking a slow breath as his eyes moved across the house again. Front door closed. No movement at the windows. No sound from inside. Too quiet. Luke stepped up beside him. "You think he's still asleep?" he asked. Caleb didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the truck again, then at the ground beneath it. Dry. No sign it had moved recently. Maybe, he said finally. Or maybe he just hasn't come outside yet. Mason joined them, cracking his neck slightly as he looked toward the house. Kid said he'd wake up soon. Caleb nodded. Which means we don't have much time. Hank walked up last, slower than the others, but just as steady. He stopped a few steps back, eyes fixed on the house like he'd seen 100 places just like it before. "Police?" Hank asked. Caleb checked his phone. Nothing yet. "They're coming," he said. "We wait." Mason shifted his weight. "And if something happens before they get here?" Caleb turned his head slightly toward him, then looked back at the house. "We're not going in unless we have to," he said. "We keep it clean." That mattered, not just for them, for Lena, for her brother, for what came after. Luke exhaled slowly, nodding. "All right." They spread out slightly after that, not aggressively, not like they were trying to surround the place, just present. Caleb stayed near the sidewalk, hands resting loosely at his sides. Mason moved closer to the edge of the driveway. Luke leaned casually against a fence post that looked like it hadn't been straight in years. Hank remained near the bikes, watching the street behind them. Anyone passing by would have seen it for what it was, a group of riders taking a break. Nothing more, nothing obvious. But there was something in the way they stood, something still. Something unmovable. Minutes passed, slow, every second stretching longer than it should. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A curtain shifted in a house across the way. Someone watching, then quickly disappearing again. And still, nothing from inside. Caleb's eyes stayed on the front door, waiting, listening. Then, a sound, faint, from inside the house. Something small, like something being knocked over. Luke straightened slightly. "You hear that?" Caleb nodded once. Mason's jaw tightened. That didn't sound like someone sleeping. Another noise followed, this time louder. A dull thud. Then, silence again. Caleb felt that weight return to his chest. He took one step forward, then stopped. Not yet. Not unless... The front door jerked open. All 4 men reacted at once, not moving forward, not aggressive, but alert. Ready. A man stepped out. Big. Bigger than Caleb expected. Broad shoulders filling the doorway, one hand braced against the frame as if he'd just woken up and needed something to steady himself. His eyes scanned the yard, then the street, then landed on them, and stayed there. For a moment, no one spoke. The man's expression shifted, confusion first, then irritation, then something sharper. "Can I help you?" he called out, voice rough, carrying across the space between them. Caleb didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He just answered, "We're fine where we are." The man stepped down onto the porch, barefoot, worn jeans, shirt wrinkled like he'd slept in it. His gaze moved from one biker to the next, counting, measuring. "You waiting on someone?" he asked. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah." A pause. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, you got the wrong house," he said. "There's nothing here for you." Caleb tilted his head just a fraction. "We'll decide that." The air shifted. Just a little, but enough. Mason took a slow step closer, not toward the man, but into a position where he could see both the front door and the side of the house. Luke adjusted his stance against the fence, more upright now. Hank didn't move at all, but his attention sharpened. The man noticed all of it, every small movement. His jaw tightened. "You boys looking for trouble?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. "No." A beat, then, "But we're not leaving either." That landed. The man took another step forward off the porch now, feet hitting the dirt of the yard. "You don't get to just stand outside my house," he said, voice rising slightly. "This isn't a show." Caleb met his gaze evenly. "We're on the sidewalk," he said. "Public space." Another pause, longer this time. The man's eyes flickered toward the road, then back to them. And that's when Caleb saw it. Not just anger, not just irritation. Something else. Something beneath it. Nervous. Hidden. Gone almost as quickly as it appeared. But it was there, and Caleb didn't miss it. In the distance, faint at first, a sound. Sirens. Far off, but coming closer. The man heard it too. His head turned slightly toward the sound, then snapped back toward Caleb. And for the first time, his confidence slipped. Just a little. Caleb didn't smile, didn't react. He just stood there, steady, unmoving, as the sound of sirens slowly grew louder down Oak Ridge Lane, and the moment they'd been waiting for finally began to arrive. The sound of the sirens grew louder, rolling down Oak Ridge Lane like a warning that couldn't be ignored. Not fast, not chaotic. Steady, deliberate. The kind of sound that told you something official was coming, and it wasn't turning around. The man in the yard heard it clearly now. His posture shifted. Not much, but enough. His shoulders, which had been squared with irritation just seconds ago, tightened in a different way. His eyes flicked once more toward the road, then back to Caleb. Calculating. Reconsidering. "Did you call them?" he asked, voice lower now. Caleb didn't answer right away. Didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. Mason shifted his stance slightly, boots pressing into the dirt. Luke stepped off the fence, standing fully upright now. Hank remained near the bikes, but his attention never left the house. No one moved forward. No one backed down. They simply held the space. And that was louder than any threat. The sirens were close now, just around the bend. The man exhaled sharply through his nose, running a hand over the back of his head. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "You don't know what you think you know." Caleb finally spoke. "Then it'll clear itself up," he said calmly. A beat. The man looked at him, really looked this time, trying to figure him out, trying to understand why a group of strangers would stand outside his house in silence and refuse to leave. Behind that front door, something shifted again, a faint sound, soft but unmistakable. Caleb heard it. So did Luke. A child's voice, muffled. The man's head turned just slightly, just enough to confirm it. And in that tiny movement, everything changed. Caleb's eyes hardened just a fraction. Not anger, not yet, but certainty. The sirens reached the street. A patrol car turned onto Oak Ridge Lane, tires crunching lightly against the uneven surface as it slowed near the house. The lights weren't flashing wildly, just a steady spin of red and blue reflecting faintly off the windows. Controlled. Professional. The car came to a stop near the curb. A door opened, then another. 2 officers stepped out. One moved with quick, efficient steps toward the yard. The other stayed a half step behind, scanning the surroundings with practiced awareness. "Afternoon," the first officer said, voice clear, composed. "We got a call for a welfare check." The man in the yard straightened slightly. "There's no problem here," he said quickly. Someone must have misunderstood. The officer didn't react to the tone, just nodded once. "Sir, we still need to take a look," she said. "Standard procedure." The man hesitated, just for a second, then forced a tight smile. "Like I said, there's nothing to see." Caleb watched closely. He didn't step in, didn't interrupt. This part wasn't his, not anymore. But he didn't move either. The officer's gaze shifted briefly toward Caleb and the others, taking in the bikes, the posture, the stillness. She understood something immediately. This wasn't random. She turned back to the man. "Sir," she said, firmer now, "we'll just take a quick look inside. Shouldn't take long." Another pause, longer this time. Then, the man stepped back, reluctantly. "Fine," he said. "Go ahead." He turned, heading toward the door. The officer followed. The second officer remained outside, positioning herself just off the walkway, close enough to act, far enough to observe. Caleb's eyes followed the first officer as she stepped inside the house. The door closed behind her, and just like that, they were back to waiting. But this time, it felt different, heavier, more fragile. Mason let out a slow breath. "That kid's in there," he muttered. Caleb didn't answer. He already knew. They all did. Seconds stretched, then a minute. No one spoke. The street stayed quiet, aside from the soft ticking of engines cooling behind them and the faint hum of wind brushing through dry branches. Then, the door opened again. The officer stepped out, and she wasn't alone. A small boy stood beside her, barefoot, pajamas wrinkled, sleeves too long, hair messy like he'd just woken up. His eyes, wide, uncertain. There was a faint red mark along the side of his neck, not fresh, but not old either. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. The boy looked around slowly, taking in the yard, the street, the strangers. Then his eyes landed on the line of bikes and stayed there. Not afraid, just unsure. The officer crouched slightly beside him, speaking softly, too low to hear from where Caleb stood. Then she gently guided him forward, toward the sidewalk, toward them. Caleb took a step forward, slow, careful. He lowered himself down to one knee as the boy approached, bringing himself to eye level. "Hey there," Caleb said quietly. The boy stopped a few feet away, studying him. Caleb didn't reach out, didn't push, just stayed still. "My name's Caleb," he said. "Your sister sent us." That did it. The boy's expression changed instantly. Not confusion, recognition. "Lena?" he asked. Caleb nodded. "Yeah, she's waiting for you." The boy's eyes filled, not with tears, not yet, but with something close to relief that he didn't quite know how to express. He took a small step forward, then another. And before anyone could say anything else, he closed the distance, wrapped his arms tightly around Caleb, holding on, hard, like he'd been holding that moment inside for longer than anyone realized. Caleb froze for half a second, then slowly, gently, placed one hand on the boy's back, steady, reassuring. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You're okay now." Behind him, Mason looked away for a moment, jaw clenched. Luke exhaled slowly, tension leaving his shoulders in a way that hadn't happened since they arrived. Even Hank shifted slightly, his gaze lowering just a bit. The officer stood nearby, watching the moment, allowing it. But only for a few seconds. Then she stepped forward. "Hey, buddy," she said gently. "We're going to take you somewhere safe, okay?" The boy didn't let go right away. His grip tightened slightly. Caleb leaned back just enough to look at him. "You're going to see your sister in a minute," he said. "She's waiting for you." That was enough. Slowly, reluctantly, the boy let go. The officer took his hand and began guiding him toward the patrol car. Caleb stood back up, watching, making sure, always making sure. As the car door opened, as the boy climbed inside, as the officer closed the door gently behind him, and just as that moment settled, a loud crash echoed from inside the house, sharp, violent, followed by a voice, angry, shouting, the kind of sound that made everything stop again. Caleb straightened immediately. The second officer turned toward the door, hand already near her radio. Inside, something was happening, and whatever it wasn't over yet. The sound from inside the house didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder. Another crash followed the first, wood against something heavy, then a sharp shout that cut through the air like a blade. The second officer immediately raised her radio. "Control, we've got a disturbance inside the residence. Stand by." Her posture changed instantly, feet planted, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the front door. The first officer, now beside the patrol car, placed a protective hand near the rear door where the boy had just been seated. Caleb didn't move forward, but everything in him was already there. Mason took one step closer to the curb, boots pressing into the edge of the street. Luke's body angled slightly, giving him a clear view of both the house and the officers. Hank remained steady, but his hands tightened slightly at his sides. The man who lived in the house had already stepped back inside after letting the officer in earlier. Now the door swung open again, hard. He came out fast this time, anger written across his face. Not confusion, not hesitation, pure frustration. "What's going on in there?" the officer demanded, stepping forward. The man pointed back toward the house. "That's what I've been telling you. There's nothing." Another crash interrupted him, louder this time, followed by a child's voice, faint but unmistakable. That was enough. The officer didn't wait. She moved. "Stay back," she said firmly to the man, raising a hand as she stepped toward the doorway. The second officer followed immediately, positioning herself just off to the side, ready. Caleb stepped forward now, but only slightly, not interfering, just close enough to see. The man's composure broke for a moment. "You can't just go in there like that," he said, voice rising. The officer didn't respond. Her focus was already inside. "Control, we're entering the residence," she said into her radio. "Possible disturbance involving a minor." Then she stepped inside. The second officer followed. The door remained open, and for a brief moment, the inside of the house was visible from the yard. Dim lighting, shadows stretching across worn furniture, a hallway leading deeper in, voices overlapping. Then, movement. And then the officers reappeared, but not empty-handed. One of them was guiding a small figure out from the hallway. Another child, Lena's brother's age or younger, but this one had already been inside. The second officer stepped out first, scanning the surroundings again. Then the first officer emerged fully, carefully guiding a woman behind her. Thin, unsteady, her posture folded inward as if she'd been carrying more than she could bear for a long time. Her eyes were wide, searching, confused. And then she saw the bikes, saw the men standing there, and something in her expression cracked open. The man who had been standing in the yard shifted abruptly. "Linda," he said under his breath. The name came out with a mix of control and warning. She didn't respond to him. Her eyes moved past him, past the officers, until they landed on Caleb. "You," she said, voice trembling. "You're the ones with my daughter?" Caleb nodded once. "She came to us," he said gently. That was all he needed to say. Her breath caught. A small sound escaped her, half relief, half fear finally letting go. "Where is she?" Linda asked quickly, stepping forward despite her weakness. Is she okay? Caleb didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't know, but because he wanted to be sure how to say it. She's safe, he said finally. At the diner, waiting for her brother. That was enough. Her knees gave slightly. The officer nearby reached out, steadying her. Easy, the officer said softly. You're all right. Linda shook her head faintly, tears beginning to gather. No, I didn't know. I didn't see. Her voice broke. The man stepped forward again. This is ridiculous, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. She's upset. She's confused. The officer turned toward him immediately. Sir, she said firmly, step back. The tone left no room for argument. He stopped, but his jaw tightened. Caleb watched all of it unfold. The pieces were aligning. Not everything, not yet, but enough. The children were out. The mother was here. The officers were in control of the situation. And the man was no longer in control of anything. Linda's eyes found Caleb again. Please, she said, voice breaking. Take me to her. Caleb nodded once. We will. Behind them, the second officer began coordinating quietly into her radio again, her voice low and professional as she relayed updates. The first officer guided Linda toward the patrol car, helping her into the back seat. The children were already being secured and looked after, speaking softly with the officers, their voices calm and reassuring. The man stood near the doorway now, no longer advancing, watching, thinking, calculating what had just changed in the span of minutes. Caleb turned slightly toward Mason and Luke. We head back, he said quietly. No one argued. No one needed to. Luke pushed off from where he stood. Mason adjusted his gloves. Hank nodded once. They moved back toward their bikes. But Caleb paused for just a moment longer, looking at the house. Not with anger, not with victory, just understanding that this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something else, something that would continue long after today. A fight, a process, a responsibility that now belonged to more than just them. He exhaled slowly, then turned away. As engines came back to life one by one, the small convoy prepared to ride back to the diner, where Lena was still waiting, not knowing that everything she had risked her safety to protect was finally coming back to her. The ride back felt different, not slower, not faster, just heavier in a way no one said out loud. The engines still hummed beneath them, the wind still cut across their jackets, and the road still stretched ahead the same as before, but something had shifted in the silence between the riders. Caleb led the way, eyes fixed on the lane ahead, though his thoughts were no longer on the road. Behind him, Mason rode steady, posture relaxed but alert. Luke kept a consistent distance, glancing occasionally at the mirrors, while Hank brought up the rear, his presence calm and grounding. No one spoke. There wasn't a need for words after what they had just seen. The convoy rolled back onto the main road, passing the familiar signs and turns that now felt closer than they had earlier. The sky remained gray, but the air seemed lighter somehow, like the weight of urgency had been partially lifted. Still, they weren't done. Not yet. Caleb's mind kept returning to Lena, the way she had sat in that diner chair, the way she hadn't asked for comfort, only direction, and how that direction had led them here. He tightened his grip slightly on the handlebars. Ahead, the diner came into view again, its simple sign, the small lot, the same place where everything had begun. Caleb slowed first, the others followed, engines dropping in unison to a lower rumble as they turned into the parking lot. And then, they stopped. Caleb cut his engine. One by one, the others did the same. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was expectant. Caleb removed his helmet and looked toward the diner window. Lena was still inside, still waiting. He could see her faint silhouette at the counter, turned slightly toward the glass, as if she'd been watching the parking lot the entire time. And now, she saw them, the bikes, returning. Her posture changed instantly. She stood up. Ruth, nearby, placed a steady hand on her shoulder as Lena moved closer to the window. Caleb didn't hesitate. He walked toward the entrance. Mason, Luke, and Hank followed behind him, boots hitting the pavement with a steady rhythm. The diner door opened. The bell above it chimed softly again. And just like before, the room seemed to hold its breath. Caleb stepped inside. His eyes immediately found Lena. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her face said everything. Hope, fear, waiting. Caleb nodded once. 2 minutes, he said quietly. That was all it took. Lena's eyes widened slightly. She turned toward the window immediately. Outside, a patrol car had just pulled into the lot. Slow, controlled, its presence unmistakable. The back door opened. Caleb stepped aside slightly as the officer helped a small boy out of the vehicle. Billy. Still small, still wearing the same pajamas, but now, not alone. Lena didn't wait. She ran, straight for the door. Ruth stepped back, letting her go without hesitation. The door opened again as Lena burst outside into the parking lot, her steps quick, uneven at first, then steady as she spotted him. "Billy!" Her voice carried across the space. The boy looked up instantly. "Lena!" And just like that, they met in the middle of the lot. Lena dropped to her knees as Billy ran into her arms, wrapping himself tightly around her neck. They held on, hard, like neither of them wanted to let go again. Caleb stood near the doorway, watching quietly. Behind him, Mason crossed his arms, his expression softening just slightly. Luke leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. Hank remained still, but his eyes carried something deeper now, something reflective. Linda stepped out of the patrol car next, slowly, carefully. Her movements unsteady at first as she looked across the lot. And then she saw them. Her children, together, safe. A small sound escaped her as her hand went to her mouth, her knees weakening for just a moment before she caught herself. Lena looked up. "Mom!" Linda didn't walk. She almost stumbled forward, and when she reached them, she dropped to her knees as well, pulling both children into her arms. The three of them held each other in the middle of that parking lot, the weight of everything they had endured finally breaking apart in quiet sobs and relieved breaths. Inside the diner, Ruth wiped her eyes discreetly, turning away for a moment to give them privacy. Caleb stayed where he was, not intruding, just witnessing. Officer Cruz approached from the patrol car, her posture relaxed now that the immediate situation had stabilized. "They'll need statements later," she said calmly, more to Caleb than anyone else. "But for now, they're safe." Caleb nodded. "Good." Behind him, Mason shifted slightly. "So that's it?" he asked quietly. "For now?" Caleb didn't take his eyes off the scene outside. "For now," he said. Luke glanced toward the family. "Hard part's just starting." Caleb nodded once. He knew that. Legal processes, paperwork, testimony, courtrooms, things that didn't end in a single day, things that required patience and strength. Billy's small voice drifted through the open door as he held onto his sister, asking something innocent, something simple, something that made Lena smile through her tears. That sound stayed with Caleb, long after the moment passed. A reminder that not everything in life was heavy. Some things were worth every difficult step that came before them. He finally turned back inside, and as he did, Lena's eyes met his from across the lot. She gave him a small nod, not the same one as before. This one carried something different: gratitude, understanding, and something else, quieter. Closure for a moment that had changed everything. The moment in the parking lot slowly began to settle. Not end, just settle. Lena still held on to Billy, one arm around his shoulders, the other resting gently on the back of his head, as if confirming he was real, that he hadn't disappeared again. Linda remained close, her hands trembling slightly as she kept one arm around each of them, her breathing uneven but gradually calming. Officer Cruz stood a few steps away, giving them space while still maintaining awareness. Caleb stayed near the diner entrance, leaning lightly against the frame, observing quietly. Not as someone in control, but as someone present. Mason and Luke remained just behind him inside, while Hank had taken a position near the bikes again, his gaze occasionally shifting between the street and the family. After a few moments, Officer Cruz stepped closer to Linda. "Ma'am," she said gently, "we'll need to take you in for a formal statement at some point, today or tomorrow. For now, we've arranged for victim services to meet you here." Linda nodded weakly. "I understand." Her voice was still fragile, but steadier than before. Lena looked up at that. "Victim services?" she asked quietly. Cruz nodded. "Yes, they help families find safe housing, support, counseling, anything you might need moving forward." Lena absorbed that information without interrupting. Billy, meanwhile, leaned slightly into Lena's side. "Are we going somewhere else?" he asked, his voice small but curious. Lena glanced at him. "Yes," she said softly. "Somewhere safe." Caleb noticed that exchange, and something in his expression softened. A few minutes later, a second vehicle pulled into the lot. A plain car, unmarked. A woman stepped out from it, tall, composed, carrying herself with quiet confidence. She didn't rush. She didn't announce herself loudly. She simply approached with purpose. Officer Cruz greeted her with a nod. "Carol," she said. Carol returned the nod, then shifted her attention to Linda and the children. "Hi," she said gently. "My name is Carol. I'm with Victim Services. I'm here to help you with next steps." Linda wiped her eyes and nodded. "Thank you. I don't even know where to begin." Carol offered a small, reassuring smile. "That's exactly why I'm here." She crouched slightly to meet Lena and Billy at eye level. "You two did something very brave today," she said calmly. "And you're not going back to that house." Lena didn't respond immediately. She just listened. Carol continued. "We have a safe place ready for you. It's temporary, but it has beds, food, and people who will take care of you while everything gets sorted out." Lena exchanged a glance with Billy. Billy's face brightened slightly. "Beds?" he asked. Carol nodded. "Bunk beds." Billy's eyes lit up a little more. "Top bunk?" Carol smiled. "We'll see." That small moment, simple, almost ordinary, brought a faint smile to Lena's face too. Caleb saw it, and he held on to that image, because moments like that mattered. Carol then turned slightly toward Linda. "We'll arrange transport and paperwork," she said. "You won't have to figure this out alone." Linda nodded again, visibly relieved to have guidance. Caleb stepped forward just slightly at that point, not interrupting the conversation, but acknowledging Carol's presence with a brief nod. "Everything good?" he asked quietly. Carol looked at him. "You're the one she chose," she said with a hint of knowing in her tone. "That says something." Caleb didn't respond to that directly. He simply replied, "She needed help getting here." Carol gave a small, almost amused smile. "And you made sure she didn't have to walk the rest of the way alone." Luke, standing just inside, leaned toward Mason slightly. "She picked him," Luke murmured, "out of everyone in that diner." Mason nodded. "Yeah, she did." Across the lot, Lena had shifted slightly, still seated on the curb with Billy beside her. She looked up toward Caleb again, then stood. Billy followed her lead. She walked toward the diner entrance, stopping a few feet in front of Caleb. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lena asked something quietly. "Why didn't you just tell me the directions and let me go?" The question was direct, honest. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He took a moment. Then he crouched slightly again so they were at the same level. "Because you didn't need directions," he said. "You already knew where you had to go." Lena studied him. "I did?" Caleb nodded. "You came here on your own, walked all that distance, didn't wait for someone else to fix it." He paused briefly. "You weren't asking for someone to solve it for you. You were asking for a way to get there." Lena listened carefully. "And you showed me that," he added. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't knowing what to do. It's deciding to do it." Lena absorbed that in silence. Then she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. A simple response, but meaningful. She looked back toward her family for a moment, then turned again to Caleb. "Thank you." This time, her voice carried something different. Not urgency, not fear, just understanding. Caleb nodded once. "You did the hard part," he said. Lena gave a small, final nod, then turned and walked back to her mother and brother. Caleb watched her go, and for a moment the world around him seemed quieter than before. Behind him, Hank spoke softly to no one in particular. "She'll remember this," he said. Luke nodded. "Yeah, she will." Mason glanced at Caleb. "Think she'll be okay?" Caleb looked out at the family gathered together. "I think she already is," he said. Not because everything was solved, not because the road ahead would be easy, but because she had already taken the first step. And sometimes, that was the hardest one. A notification buzzed on Caleb's phone. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from Officer Cruz. He read it quietly, then exhaled. "She's got a lawyer," he said. Luke frowned slightly. "For the guy?" Caleb nodded. "Yeah." Mason crossed his arms. "So it's not over?" "No," Caleb said. "It's not." He looked back toward the family again. "Now comes the part where it gets harder in a different way." Luke understood immediately. "Court." Caleb nodded. "Statements, testimony, details." Hank stepped forward slightly. "The girl's gonna have to speak." Caleb's eyes remained steady. "Yeah." A pause. Luke looked back toward Lena. "She's strong," Luke said quietly. Caleb didn't disagree. "She is," he said, but his tone carried something deeper. Strong enough to tell the truth, even when it's not easy. The bike sat idle behind them. The road stretched beyond the diner, continuing as it always had. But for the people standing here now, nothing would be quite the same again. And in the middle of it all, a small girl who had once asked a simple question had already begun something much bigger than she realized. The afternoon began to settle into a quieter rhythm. The urgency that had filled the air earlier had softened, replaced by a steady, grounded calm, like a storm that had passed but left its weight behind in the silence that followed. Inside the diner, Lena sat beside Billy at the same counter where it had all begun. This time, she wasn't perched at the edge. She sat fully, relaxed, at least a little. Billy leaned against her shoulder, his energy slowly returning, curiosity replacing the uncertainty that had lingered in his eyes earlier. He reached for the glass of water in front of him, taking small sips, then looking around the diner as if seeing it properly for the first time. Ruth moved behind the counter, quietly preparing more food without being asked. Eggs, toast, something warm for everyone. Carol stood nearby, speaking softly with Linda, guiding her through what paperwork would come next, explaining shelter arrangements, timelines, and options in a calm, reassuring tone. Officer Cruz remained present, but less formal now. Her posture relaxed as the immediate crisis had transitioned into support and coordination. Outside, the bikes remained parked in a neat line. Caleb, Mason, Luke, and Hank stood near them, talking in low voices. Not about the past, not yet about the future, just reflecting. Mason leaned against his bike, arms crossed. "Kid handled herself better than most adults would have," he said quietly. Luke nodded. "She didn't panic." Hank gave a small, thoughtful hum. "No," he said. "She planned." Caleb stood slightly apart from them, hands resting on the seat of his bike as he looked back toward the diner window. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "She did." A pause followed. Then Mason glanced at him. "You ever think about that?" he asked. "What she saw when she chose you?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained on the diner. "I think she saw someone who wouldn't turn away," he said finally. Luke tilted his head slightly. "That simple?" Caleb nodded. "That simple." Inside, Lena suddenly turned toward the window, as if she felt his presence again. Their eyes met across the glass. No words, just recognition. Lena gave a small wave. Caleb returned it with a subtle nod. Nothing more, but enough. Billy noticed the exchange and looked between them. "Is that him?" he asked Lena. Lena smiled faintly. "Yes." Billy studied Caleb for a moment, then asked, "Is he one of the bikers?" Lena nodded. "All of them are." Billy seemed to process that, then asked the question children often ask without hesitation. "Why do they all stay together?" Lena thought for a moment before answering. "Because they look out for each other," she said. Billy seemed to accept that without further questioning. Outside, Carol stepped out of the diner briefly, approaching Caleb and the others. "We've confirmed placement," she said. "There's a temporary family unit available this afternoon. Linda has agreed." Caleb nodded. "That's good." Carol's gaze shifted between them. "You all did more than just make a phone call today," she said. "You stayed." Mason shrugged slightly. "Didn't feel like there was another option." Carol smiled faintly. "There usually isn't, for people who choose to notice." She then looked at Caleb directly. "And you," she added, "you didn't hesitate." Caleb met her gaze. "She needed help getting to the right place," he said simply. Carol nodded. "Most people would have just given directions." Caleb didn't respond, because the truth of that didn't need to be explained. Inside the diner, Linda sat now at the same counter, a cup of tea in her hands, her shoulders less tense than before. She looked different than she had earlier, still tired, still carrying the weight of what had happened, but no longer completely lost. Carol stood beside her, continuing the quiet conversation. Lena sat between Linda and Billy now, 3 hands occasionally resting on each other's arms. A small circle of presence, of family. Not perfect, not resolved, but together. Billy suddenly leaned closer to Lena. "Are we really not going back there?" he asked softly. Lena shook her head. "No." "Ever?" She paused, then answered honestly. "No, not ever." Billy seemed to accept that. "Good," he said simply. Lena glanced at her mother. Linda reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from Lena's face. "I'm sorry," Linda said quietly, "for everything. I should have seen more." Lena looked at her, not with blame, not with anger, just understanding. "You did what you could," Lena said. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was enough for now. Outside, Mason checked his watch. "Think they'll need anything else from us?" he asked. Caleb shook his head slightly. "Not today." Luke looked toward the road. "So we just ride?" Caleb nodded. "Yeah." Hank adjusted his gloves. "Long day," he said quietly. Caleb let out a small breath. "Longer than most." A few minutes later, Officer Cruz approached them again. "Transport's arranged," she said. "Carol will go with them to the shelter." Caleb nodded. "Good." Cruz looked at the group of bikers for a moment, then said something that carried a note of respect. "You didn't interfere. You didn't escalate. You helped keep things controlled." Mason gave a slight shrug. "That's the job." Cruz smiled faintly. Not everyone would see it that way. She then turned back toward the diner. "Thank you," she added. Caleb gave a small nod in response. Inside, Lena stepped away from the counter one last time and walked toward the door. She paused just before stepping out, then looked back at her family. Linda gave her a reassuring nod. Billy waved. Carol stood nearby, ready to guide them forward. Lena turned again and walked out into the parking lot. She approached Caleb directly, stopping in front of him. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lena asked quietly, "Will we be okay?" Caleb didn't give a rushed answer. He looked at her, not as a child in crisis, but as someone who had already shown more strength than most people twice her age. "You already started being okay," he said. Lena considered that, then nodded. "Okay." She stepped back slightly, then turned toward her family again. But before walking away completely, she added one more thing. "Thank you for not just pointing." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "You didn't need just pointing," he said. Lena smiled faintly, then walked back to Linda and Billy. The three of them stood together once more. And this time, they didn't look like they were waiting anymore. They looked like they were moving forward. Caleb watched them for a moment longer, then turned back toward his bike. The others followed. Engines would soon start again, and the road would call them back, as it always did. But for now, they stood still long enough to understand what had just changed, not just for the family, but for them as well. Because sometimes, the road doesn't just take you somewhere. Sometimes, it takes you through something that stays with you long after the ride is over. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the parking lot. What had started as a tense, uncertain morning was now settling into something closer to closure, but not an ending, just a transition. Inside the diner, the final preparations were underway. Carol stood near the entrance with Linda, confirming one last time that everything was in place. The transportation vehicle had arrived quietly, parked just beyond the diner's view, ready to take them to the temporary shelter. Officer Cruz reviewed a few final notes, her presence still steady, still attentive, but no longer urgent. Lena stood beside Billy, holding his hand this time without hesitation. Billy clutched a small paper napkin he had folded into a rough shape, something to occupy his hands, something to hold on to. Linda approached them both. She knelt slightly, bringing herself down to their level. "Okay," she said softly. "It's time." Lena nodded. Billy looked up. "Are we all going together?" he asked. Linda smiled faintly. "Yes, all of us." That seemed to reassure him. Outside, Caleb and the others were preparing to leave. Engines hadn't started yet. They were taking a moment. Mason adjusted his gloves. Luke checked his bike one last time. Hank stood with his arms at his sides, watching the diner quietly. Caleb was already on his bike, but not fully ready to move. His gaze kept returning to the window. Inside, he could see them. Lena, Billy, Linda, together. Carol opened the diner door and stepped out first, followed by Linda holding Billy's hand. Lena walked just beside them. The group moved toward the waiting vehicle. The atmosphere was calm, structured, safe. Officer Cruz followed at a measured pace, ensuring everything proceeded as planned. As Lena reached the vehicle, she paused briefly, then turned around. Her eyes searched the parking lot and found Caleb. He was already watching her. She raised her hand slightly, not a big wave this time, just a small acknowledgement. Caleb responded with a simple nod. No words. None were needed. Billy climbed into the vehicle first, assisted by Carol. Linda followed. Lena stepped in last. Before closing the door, she looked out one more time, at the diner, at the bikers, at the place where everything had changed. Then she stepped inside. The door closed gently, not abruptly, not like an ending, but like a continuation. The vehicle started and began to move slowly out of the lot. Linda sat in the back, holding both children close. Carol sat in the front passenger seat, speaking quietly with the driver. As they pulled onto the road, Lena leaned slightly toward the window, watching, not out of fear anymore, but out of reflection. Outside, Caleb finally lifted his hand slightly as the vehicle passed. A final, subtle gesture. Luke noticed. "She's gone," he said quietly. Caleb nodded. "Yeah." Mason exhaled. "Feels like something ended." Hank corrected him gently. "Something started." Luke glanced at him. "How do you mean?" Hank looked toward the road where the vehicle had disappeared. "They're not where they were this morning," he said. "None of them are." Caleb started his bike. The engine came to life with a steady, familiar rumble. One by one, the others followed. Mason, Luke, Hank. The sound of engines filled the lot again, but this time it carried a different weight. Not urgency, not confrontation, just movement, purpose. Caleb glanced once more toward the diner window. Empty now, but not forgotten. Then he looked ahead. "Let's ride," he said. The others responded without hesitation. Engines revved slightly. Clutches engaged, and one by one the bikes rolled forward, leaving the diner behind. The road stretched out ahead of them, open, endless, familiar. But as they merged onto it, something subtle had shifted, not in the road itself, but in the people riding it. Because today, they hadn't just traveled miles. They had stepped into someone else's life at a moment that mattered most. And sometimes, those moments don't just pass through you. They stay, long after the engines quiet down, long after the road fades into the distance, and long after the story seems to have ended. Somewhere, a small girl who once asked for directions had found something far more important, a reason to move forward. And the people who chose to stand beside her had done the same. The road grew quieter as the miles stretched on. The convoy of bikes moved in formation at a steady pace, engines humming in a low, synchronized rhythm that seemed to blend with the fading light of the day. The air had cooled slightly, the heat of the afternoon giving way to a softer, more reflective evening. Caleb rode at the front, his posture relaxed but attentive, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Behind him, Mason and Luke rode side by side for a stretch, occasionally glancing at each other without needing words. Hank followed slightly behind, maintaining distance but staying connected to the group's pace. They weren't rushing. There was nowhere urgent to be anymore, just the road and the silence that came with it. After a few minutes, Luke broke the quiet through the intercom. "You think she'll remember us?" he asked. Mason responded first. "Yeah, but not the way you think." Luke tilted his head slightly. "What do you mean?" Mason glanced forward. "She won't remember the bikes first," he said. "She'll remember that someone showed up when she needed it most." Luke considered that, then nodded. "Yeah, that makes sense." Up ahead, Caleb's voice came through clearly. "She'll remember how she felt," he said. The others listened. "That's what lasts," Caleb continued. "Not the noise, not the bikes, not the moment itself." A brief pause. "The feeling that you weren't alone." No one responded immediately, because there wasn't much to add. Hank's voice came in, calm and measured. "That stays with people longer than anything else." The group continued riding in silence again, the conversation settling into the background of the road. As the sun dipped lower, the sky began to shift, warm tones of orange and gold blending into deeper shades of blue. The headlights of the bikes flickered on one by one, forming a line of steady lights moving through the quiet landscape. Caleb's mind drifted briefly. Not to the house, not to the confrontation, but to Lena, her voice, her composure, the way she had stood still in the middle of chaos and still chosen a direction forward. He exhaled slowly. Luke noticed the subtle shift in Caleb's posture. "You're thinking about it," Luke said. Caleb didn't deny it. "Yeah." Mason leaned slightly forward. "About what she asked you?" Caleb nodded. "Why she chose me?" Luke added, "And your answer." Caleb's tone remained even. "She didn't choose me," he said. "She chose trust." Hank spoke after a moment. "And you meted." That simple exchange seemed to settle something in the group. The road ahead curved gently, leading them away from the city lights into a quieter stretch of open highway. No traffic, no distractions, just motion. Caleb shifted gears smoothly. The engine responded with a deeper tone. The others followed in sequence, maintaining formation without needing instruction. This was routine for them. But today, the meaning behind it felt slightly different, more grounded, less about the ride itself, and more about what it represented. After several more minutes, Luke spoke again. "So what happens now?" Mason replied casually, "We go back to normal." Luke smirked slightly. "Normal doesn't usually include things like today." Mason chuckled lightly. "True." Caleb added quietly, "Normal is just what you do after something like today." Hank nodded, even though no one could see it clearly. "Back to the road," he said. The group continued forward. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, the fading light marking the transition from day into night. Behind them, the diner, the house, the confrontation, the decisions, all of it receded into distance. Not gone, just behind them now. But for each of them, something had changed. Subtle, unspoken, permanent in its own quiet way. Caleb kept his eyes on the road as the first stars began to appear above, and as the engines carried them forward into the night, he understood something clearly. They weren't just riders moving from one place to another. They were part of moments that mattered, moments that didn't always get remembered in headlines, but lived on in the people who experienced them. And sometimes, that was the most important place for a story to exist. Not in the telling, but in the impact it left behind. The night had fully settled in now. The sky above the highway was deep and clear, scattered with stars that seemed brighter out here, away from the noise and lights of the city. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of darkness, broken only by the steady glow of headlights cutting through the quiet. The group had been riding for some time in silence again. Not the heavy kind of silence from earlier, but something calmer, more natural. The kind that comes when words are no longer needed. Caleb led the formation smoothly, his bike holding a steady pace as the others followed in alignment behind him. Luke eventually broke the quiet over comms. "Anyone else hungry?" he asked casually. Mason responded first. "Always." Hank added dryly, "You're always hungry." Luke chuckled. "Yeah, but tonight feels like we earned it." That got a faint, shared sense of agreement across the group. Caleb spoke next. "There's a stop up ahead," he said. "Small place. Open late." Mason nodded, even though Caleb couldn't see it directly. "Sounds good." The group maintained formation as they continued riding, headlights forming a line of moving light across the dark highway. After several more minutes, a set of roadside lights appeared in the distance, subtle at first, then clearer as they approached. A small diner, quiet, open, waiting. Caleb slowed slightly, signaling the group. One by one, the bikes reduced speed, engines shifting into a lower tone as they prepared to pull in. They turned off the highway and into the parking lot, tires rolling over gravel and pavement with a soft crunching sound. The bikes came to a gradual stop. Engines idled, headlights remained on for a moment, illuminating the empty lot. Then, one by one, they were switched off. Silence followed. A different kind of silence now. Not tense, not reflective, just still. Caleb removed his helmet and looked toward the diner. Warm light spilled through the windows, contrasting with the cool darkness outside. Luke stretched slightly after dismounting. "Feels like a different day," he said. Mason nodded. "Yeah, like everything before this morning was a week ago." Hank stepped off his bike, adjusting his gloves. "Time feels like that sometimes," he said. Caleb didn't respond immediately. He looked back at the road they had come from, not in regret, just acknowledgement. Then he turned toward the diner. "Let's eat," he said. The group moved together toward the entrance. As they approached the door, Caleb paused briefly, just for a moment. Not because of hesitation, but because of perspective. Earlier that day, they had entered a diner and been part of something unexpected. Now, they were entering another one. But this time, they carried something different with them. Not urgency, not tension, but experience. They opened the door and stepped inside. A bell above the entrance chimed softly as they entered. Inside, the diner was modest, warm, and mostly empty. A few late-night patrons sat scattered across tables, conversations low and relaxed. A waitress behind the counter looked up as they entered. She didn't react with surprise, only a brief glance. Then a nod of acknowledgement. Caleb returned it. The group found a booth large enough to accommodate them and began settling in. Luke slid into one side, Mason beside him, Hank across from them. Caleb sat near the end, his posture relaxed as he leaned slightly back against the seat. Menus were picked up, pages turned, but conversation remained light. Luke glanced at Caleb. "So," he said, "back to normal?" Caleb gave a faint, knowing look. "Something like that." Mason added, "Normal with a story attached." Luke smirked. "Yeah, that sounds about right." Hank leaned back slightly. "Stories tend to follow you on roads like ours." Caleb nodded. "They do." A waitress approached their table, pen in hand. "Evening, gentlemen. What can I get you?" Orders were placed, simple, familiar. No one rushed. No one needed to. As they waited, the group settled into a comfortable rhythm again, one that felt both ordinary and meaningful at the same time. Caleb glanced briefly out the window. The road outside was quiet, empty, endless. Somewhere out there, a vehicle carrying a family had already arrived at its destination, a place of safety, a place to begin again. He allowed himself a small, quiet moment of reflection. Not pride, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. Luke noticed the subtle expression on Caleb's face. "You thinking about her again?" he asked. Caleb didn't deny it. "Yeah." Luke nodded. "Yeah, me too." Mason added softly, "She's gonna be all right." Hank agreed. "With the right support, she will be." Caleb's gaze remained steady. "She already started the hard part," he said. Luke leaned back slightly. "Then I guess the rest is just time." Caleb nodded. Time and the right people around her. The waitress returned with water for the table, placing glasses down with quiet efficiency. The night continued its steady pace outside. Inside the diner, the bikers sat together, not as a force, not as an interruption, but as a group that had moved through something real and come out the other side unchanged in appearance, yet different in understanding. Because not every journey ends when you stop riding. Some continue quietly, in memory, in perspective, and in the small, unseen ways people carry forward after they've been part of something that mattered. The meal came and went in a calm, unhurried rhythm. Plates were set down, conversations flowed lightly, and for a while, the night felt almost ordinary again, like the events of earlier that day had been folded neatly into memory, present, but no longer pressing. The clinking of cutlery, low voices from nearby tables, and the soft hum of background music filled the space inside the diner. Caleb sat back slightly after finishing his meal, one hand resting near his glass of water, his posture relaxed but attentive as always. Across from him, Mason pushed his plate aside. "Been a while since we had a day like that," he said. Luke raised an eyebrow. "You mean where we actually did something instead of just writing?" Mason smirked. "Yeah, something like that." Hank wiped his hands with a napkin, then set it down neatly. "Not every ride turns into a moment that matters," he said. "But when it does, you remember it." Luke leaned back. "Today definitely qualifies." Caleb listened to them quietly, then added, "It wasn't about the ride." The others looked at him. "It was about showing up when it counted." Mason nodded slowly. "Yeah, I can live with that." For a brief moment, the table fell into a comfortable silence again. Not awkward, not empty, just settled. After a few seconds, Luke glanced toward Caleb. "You ever think about how random it was?" he asked. "She could have picked anyone in that diner." Caleb shook his head slightly. "Not random." Luke tilted his head. "How so?" Caleb's answer came without hesitation. "People don't choose in moments like that based on logic." He paused. "They choose based on instinct, on what feels safe." Hank added, "And she trusted her instinct." Mason folded his arms. "Which turned out to be the right call." Caleb didn't react outwardly to that, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in his expression. A waitress approached their table again. "Everything all right here?" she asked. Luke nodded. "Yeah, food was great." She smiled politely. "Glad to hear it." She collected a couple of empty plates and moved on. The group remained seated for a moment longer. Outside the window, the parking lot was still. No movement, no urgency. Just the faint reflection of the diner lights against the glass. Caleb's eyes drifted briefly toward the entrance, then back to the table. "Let's get moving soon," he said. Mason checked his watch. "Yeah, getting late." Luke stretched slightly. "Long day or not, the road's still calling." Hank stood first. "Always does." One by one, they began to rise from the booth, leaving payment on the table and preparing to head out. As they stepped toward the exit, Caleb slowed slightly near the door. He looked back into the diner for a brief moment, not at anything in particular, just taking it in. Then he pushed the door open. The bell above chimed softly again as they stepped outside into the cool night air. The bikes sat where they had left them, aligned and waiting under the dim glow of the parking lot lights. The group moved with quiet efficiency. Helmets were put on, gloves adjusted, engines checked. No one spoke much, not because there was nothing to say, but because the connection between them didn't require it. Caleb mounted his bike and started the engine. The familiar rumble returned, steady and grounding. One by one, the others followed. Mason, Luke, Hank. The engines formed a low, synchronized presence in the quiet night. Caleb glanced once more at the road ahead, then gave a slight nod. The group responded in kind. And together, they rolled out of the parking lot, back onto the highway. The lights of the diner faded behind them as the bikes merged into the darkness once more, headlights cutting forward into the open stretch of road. The night stretched endlessly ahead. No clear destination, no urgency guiding them, just motion. And the shared understanding that wherever they went, they carried more than just themselves. They carried the moments they had been part of, the choices they had made, and the quiet weight of knowing that sometimes being in the right place at the right time can change more than a single day. It can change the way you see every road that comes after it. The highway opened up into a long, uninterrupted stretch of darkness. No nearby towns, no heavy traffic, just the occasional distant glow of headlights far ahead or behind, fading in and out like passing thoughts in the night. Caleb rode at a steady pace, the rhythm of the engine beneath him becoming almost meditative. The others followed in formation, their spacing consistent, their movements smooth. Each rider locked into a shared flow that required no verbal coordination. After several minutes of quiet riding, Luke's voice came through again, softer this time. "You ever notice how days like today feel longer than they should?" Mason responded first. "That's because a lot happened." Luke chuckled lightly. "Yeah, understatement of the year." Hank added, "Moments like that compress time. You remember more, so it feels stretched." Luke considered that. "Yeah, that makes sense." Caleb listened but didn't immediately join in. His focus remained forward, but his thoughts were still active beneath the surface. Luke continued, "Feels like we started the day at that diner and somehow ended up in a completely different one tonight." Mason nodded, even though no one could see it clearly. "Same place, same people, but not the same day." Caleb finally spoke. "Because it wasn't just about location." The others listened. It was about what changed in between. A brief pause followed. Hank's voice came in calmly. "And what we chose to do when it did." No one added anything after that, because there wasn't much more to say. The group continued riding in silence again, the sound of their engines blending into the open air. The road ahead remained clear, no intersections, no interruptions, just a steady path forward. Caleb shifted slightly in his seat, maintaining comfort as the miles passed beneath them. The night air felt cool against his jacket, the motion of the bike steady and controlled. Behind him, Mason adjusted his posture slightly. Luke checked his mirrors briefly. Hank maintained his position, consistent as ever. The formation held, reliable, unspoken. After some time, Luke spoke again, but this time, his tone was different, more reflective. "You think we'll run into something like that again?" Mason answered. "Probably." Luke exhaled. "Yeah, figures." Caleb added quietly, "Not everything we encounter will be the same." Luke responded, "No, but moments that matter tend to show up when you least expect them." Caleb didn't disagree. "That's why you stay ready." Hank's voice followed, "Not looking for them, just prepared when they arrive." Luke nodded to himself. "Yeah, I like that." The road continued straight ahead, the horizon blending into darkness. The bikes moved in unison, their headlights forming a small, moving cluster of light in an otherwise vast and quiet space. For a while, no one spoke, and in that silence, something subtle settled in among them. Not just reflection on what had happened, but a shared understanding of what it meant. Not every ride carries significance. Not every day leaves a mark. But when one does, it stays with you. Not loudly, not constantly, but in moments like this, when the road is empty, the night is quiet, and your thoughts have space to catch up with everything you've experienced. Caleb's mind returned once more to Lena, not in a distracting way, but as a steady point of reference, a reminder of why that day had unfolded the way it did. He adjusted his grip slightly on the handlebars, then focused forward again. The road stretched endlessly ahead, no clear endpoint visible. But that was never the point, because for them, the journey itself was where meaning often revealed itself. And sometimes, the most important part of the ride wasn't where you were going. It was what you carried with you while you got there. The engines continued their steady hum as the group moved deeper into the night, together, aligned, and quietly aware that the road ahead would always hold new stories, waiting for the right moment to unfold. The night had grown deeper now. The highway was quieter than before, the occasional passing vehicle appearing and disappearing like fleeting shadows in the distance. The group continued riding in formation, their engines steady, their presence calm and unified. No urgency remained, no destination demanded attention. Only the road, and the quiet understanding of where they had been and what they had been part of. After some time, Caleb gradually reduced his speed. The others followed his lead without question. The formation began to slow, then drift toward the side of the highway where a wide turnout lay ahead, an open space overlooking a stretch of darkened landscape. Caleb signaled. The group pulled in together. One by one, the bikes came to a controlled stop. Engines idled softly, then were cut. Silence returned. Not empty silence, but one filled with presence, the kind that settles after a long journey. Helmets came off, gloves were removed. No one spoke immediately. Instead, they stood or leaned against their bikes, looking out into the distance. The night air was cool and still. Above them, the stars were clear and scattered across the sky. Mason broke the silence first. "Feels like we should say something," he said. Luke gave a faint shrug. "Or maybe we already did, earlier today." Hank nodded slightly. "Actions tend to speak louder than anything we could add." Caleb stood near the edge of the turnout, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Not lost in thought, but grounded in it. After a moment, Luke walked over and stood beside him. "So, what now?" Luke asked. Caleb didn't look away from the distance. "Now, we keep riding. Luke smirked slightly. Same as always. Caleb nodded. Same as always. A brief pause followed. Then Luke added, quieter this time. You think she'll be okay? Caleb finally turned his head slightly. Yes, he said. Not with hesitation, not with uncertainty, but with calm confidence. Because she already made the decision to move forward. Luke nodded. Yeah, she did. Mason joined them. And she wasn't alone when she made it. Hank stepped closer as well. Sometimes that's all it takes. The group stood together for a moment longer, looking out into the night. No further words were exchanged, because everything that needed to be understood was already clear among them. Caleb reached for his helmet again. The others followed. One by one, they prepared to get back on their bikes. Engines would start again. The road would continue. And life would move forward in its steady, unbroken rhythm. But before mounting his bike, Caleb paused one final time. Not long, just enough to reflect on the question Lena had asked, and the answer he had given. She hadn't needed directions. She had needed a path. And in choosing to ask, she had already taken the first step toward it. Caleb put on his helmet, secured his gloves, then mounted his bike. The others did the same. Engines roared back to life, filling the quiet space with a familiar, grounding sound. Caleb looked ahead, then gave a small nod. The group responded, and together they rolled out once more onto the open road. Headlights cutting through the darkness, engines moving in harmony, a line of riders continuing forward into the night. But this time, they weren't just traveling. They were carrying something with them, a reminder of a moment that mattered, a moment where being present made all the difference. And somewhere far behind them, a small family was beginning a new chapter, not defined by where they had been, but by the fact that they had chosen to move forward. And sometimes, that choice is the true beginning of a new story, not the ending of the old one, just the moment where everything starts to change.